Hi there, and welcome to the Positive Talk Podcast. Your hosts, Julie and Chuck, are pretty excited about Season 4 and encourage you to settle in. Take a deep breath and enjoy this week's episode while they merge faith and psychology with a twist of encouragement. So, welcome again to the Positive Talk Podcast. Here are your hosts, Julie Homrich and Chuck Allen.
Hey, everybody, and thanks so much for joining us on another edition of the Positive Talk Podcast. And it's a great day to find an encouraging and positive word. As always, I'm joined by my good friend and psychotherapist, Julie Homrich. Julie, it's going to be an interesting topic today. I mean, when I hear the term offended,
yes.
I mean, this is a hot button across the whole world.
Oh, yeah. That offended me. I'm so offended. I think everybody in our culture is offended at one thing or the other right now.
I don't know anybody that's not offended by something right now.
Yeah.
Odds are good we have offended somebody by talking about being offended already.
Oh, absolutely. Somebody might be offended.
So it could be a fun topic.
Anything.
But I do hear that phrase a lot. Why are we so offended by everything? I mean, it seems like every day there's someone or something that we are offended by. Maybe it's a political candidate, a commercial, maybe even just a Facebook status, but we can't seem to help being offended by something. So in this week's Positive Talk Podcast, we're going to take a look at what makes us so offended, from examining our own biases to understanding maybe the power of words and how they affect us, but more importantly, we've created a word that we want to try to work through, and is how do we live unoffendable?
Yeah, it seems kind of like a pipe dream sometimes, right?
Yeah,
that we
it
could
does.
actually walk through life with that sense of peace. Because even though being offended feels empowering at the moment, it actually has some pretty significant effects on our spiritual life, our emotional life, and even our physical health.
Well, that was one of the things I couldn't wait to talk about, is how taking on like constant offenses has a power on us that does affect everything: how we think, how we act, how we react, how we plan, how we interact with family and one another.
Yeah, and it affects our physical health as well in a very significant way.
You know, that's true in my life. Like when I take on an offense, I'm the one paying the price for it.
Yeah. Well, when we do that, when we live in that kind of from a biological perspective, in that moment, our body's releasing a number of chemicals, that are basically telling us that we have to act and we have to do something about this. And that can be really damaging for us if we're constantly put in that kind of adrenal state of being activated.
Absolutely.
So today we're not going to just tell you, okay, don't be offended, just forgive, although that's a piece of it.
Sure.
But to just stay there, I think would be kind of an oversimplification.
Yeah, totally.
Right?
Matter of fact, I've heard people say that, just get over it.
Right.
And the problem is that just doesn't work.
Just forgive.
Yeah, that's almost a dumb statement when you think about it. I mean, because the very nature that you've taken up an offense says you've already grabbed hold of it to some degree.
Yeah, I like to use the term somebody has hooked you. Like they
that,
put a little hook in you, and now you feel hooked and tethered to them or what they said about you or what they think about you. Yeah. And it's very, very easy to kind of carry that around and live in this state of
when you mentioned that about being hooked, I loved fish. The nature of a fish hook is different than like a shepherd's crook. Like a shepherd's crook is soft and it's a bit pliable, and on the end it's not barbed. A fish hook that gets stuck in your finger, the part that does the damage isn't the fact that it's sharp. It's that once it goes in, it's got that barb and it tears on the way out.
Yeah, and I think we feel that way. Many of us have people in our lives, or even political parties in our lives, where we just feel like, why do they get under my skin so much, right?
Yeah. And it's that barb.
It is. Yeah. It is. And so when we take a look at the definition of being offended, so the definition that I found was resentful or annoyed, typically as a result of a perceived insult.
Wow. Okay. The word perceived?
Big deal.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a lot to unpack here, but let's start with the resentful piece.
All right.
So resentment, it's a strong emotion, right? Those of us who've experienced it, which is all of us to some degree.
Right.
We know it's a strong emotion, and it's one that lingers.
Yeah.
I define it as anger with no place to go. So you're just
Wow.
carrying all this anger and it turns into resentment, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So why do we carry resentment? Well, we may feel powerless to change the person that hurt us, right? That's
Right,
kind of where
right.
somebody offends us, they hurt us, and we feel very powerless in that moment. So we just carry around that resentment.
Right.
We also tend to put walls up when we feel resentment. We just want to keep people out. And when we do this, Chuck, we assume that it'll keep us safe from them, like that we're never going to get hurt again, right?
Right.
But resentment doesn't actually keep us safe. It really more so imprisons us because then we're not really able to learn, forgive, grow, and connect with other people.
That is that's a really deep concept to wrap your head around. That hanging on to resentment is literally imprisoning us. We've locked the door,
Yeah.
and then we threw the key outside of our reach.
Yeah. And then nobody can help us, right? Because
Right.
we're not
Yeah.
allowing
Yeah.
we're not allowing anybody in.
Well, that would mean, though, that there is a radical difference between that wall that you create and a boundary.
Yeah. And sometimes when people hear boundaries, they think you're putting up a wall,
Yeah.
right? But a boundary is movable. A
Yeah,
boundary
yeah.
is fluid based on what your needs are in that moment, based on the other person's ability to be trustworthy and
Yeah,
things like that.
yeah.
So boundaries actually keep us safe. Boundaries are what we set and what we control to determine another's level of access to us, whether
like
that's
that,
physical,
yeah.
emotional, spiritual. We have the choice to move boundaries or adjust them as necessary. Like I said, if the person becomes more trustworthy, we slowly, move that boundary in a way that is in sync with that.
Because I've learned boundaries are best written in pencil.
Yeah.
Because they can be easily moved.
Right.
They were designed to be moved, right? A wall, however, has a deep footer. It is structured where it's there in permanency.
It's fortified and it's based on fear a lot of the time.
Yeah, which sounds exactly like a prison,
Yeah.
right?
Well, and that's where it's a difference between us having an active role in setting a boundary. We hold onto our boundaries, right?
Right,
But resentment and offense kind of holds onto us. I think that's a big distinguishing difference.
Yeah, I like that. I will say, I think one of the things that may help, folks that are listening to us that are like followers of Jesus, I think one of the things that could really be powerful is to understand that the Scripture gives us a picture of how we don't have to, or we shouldn't hang on to even what is perceived to be something that gives us reason to hold to grudge or insult.
Yeah, well, it's always justified in our minds,
Yeah,
right? Like,
yeah.
of course I should be angry at them or offended by them. Look at what they did, right?
Right, yeah. And in Christian circles, it sounds so, it's preposterous to have this conversation in some ways. But on the other hand, in Christian circles, it's so normal for Christians to be so easily offended.
Yeah.
And yet, the wisest man writes in the book of Proverbs, a fool is quick-tempered. Okay, we got that part, right?
Yeah, we know
and we love to point that one out. But now hear the rest of it. But a wise person stays calm when insulted. And so
I love it says when, not if.
Yeah, when.
When.
Yeah, because
we will feel it.
It is going to happen, right?
Yeah.
So I think maybe one of the things that I would encourage folks is, one, see perceived hurt or see perceived insult. And stop and ask yourself this way: do I have to take that bait? Going back to the hook, do I have to take that bait?
Yeah. A visual I like to use is imagine when somebody's saying something to you, or if you're feeling perpetually offended, you feel like they're saying something at you, right? Just imagine them putting it on a table in front of you.
Right.
And you can choose to pick it up or not.
Yeah.
But I think that goes back to what you're saying. Are we going to take the bait or not?
Yeah.
Right?
I don't know, Julie, that it's possible to live in peace if you constantly take the bait.
Yeah.
Because it's this inner turmoil. I hear you quote Scripture a lot when you say perfect love casts out fear, right? Well, a lot of offense, and especially taking up the anger and resentment that comes with it, is based in fear.
Yeah.
Right? A ton of it is. But I'm also reminded of something that doesn't seem like this would be a text you would use in this conversation about being unoffendable. But when Paul writes the love chapter, he uses this phrase. He says that love is not easily provoked or offended.
Yeah.
right? And so you look at this and think, okay, then if God is love, then love is not easily offended. If we are to grow to become more like our Creator, then we grow to become less offended by this world, and we become less offendable.
Offendable. Yeah. Yeah. And I think sometimes the things that hold us back from that, Chuck, is this sense of, many people who are easily offended, they're very justice oriented.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And we get this sense, and especially in the modern American Christian church, that there's all of these injustices toward us, right?
Yeah.
Which is, if you really go overseas, my husband would say, like, we have it pretty good here, right?
Yeah.
But we truly believe that we are in the center of injustice whenever we're offended.
That is so stinking true. And when you state it that simply, I think people would say, oh, well, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Until you are in that circle and you take it up.
Yeah. Well, the emotions are high at that point.
Because you justify, right?
You justify, yeah. And every single time we have an interaction with another human, there are a couple things going on. One main thing is that when we're talking with someone, or when somebody says something to us, or when we have an emotional response, we are actually writing our own story about that interaction. We each have our own narrative. There's actually a whole field of therapy called narrative therapy, and it's all about the stories that you're telling yourself. So we write our own story about our intentions, about the other person's intentions, and when we are easily offended, that story usually paints the other person as the villain and us as the victim of injustice, right?
Okay, so this concept of the narrative, is it constantly running in our head through that conversation with other? Is it just there?
Yeah, I think sometimes it's not conscious, right?
Right.
But we have to be able to conceptualize that to make sense of our interactions with people and how we stand, in connection to other people.
Because I don't think what you're saying is like, I suffered from this early on in my leadership career, where sometimes I would be looking at someone like I'm looking at you right now, but my mind would be thinking about how I'm going to respond to you, not listening to you.
Yeah.
So we're not talking about that.
No.
But we're talking about this subconscious narrative that has the ability to conceive something based on a perception, not always reality. And as a result, we can create an offense that may have never intended to be there.
Oh, yes. And that's what happens most of the time, right?
Yeah.
But what we do is we expect others to judge us on our intentions. Like if we hurt someone, we're like, oh, I didn't intend to hurt you, right? But then we judge others based on their actions. So we expect others to judge us.
Okay, will you do me a favor and just say that all over again?
We expect others to judge us on our intentions.
Right. I didn't mean to do that. Give me a break.
Right. But then we judge others based on their actions.
How dare you?
How dare you do that, right? Not, oh, I wonder, maybe you didn't intend to hurt me, right?
Oh, Julie, that's worth the whole podcast right there. If we can have a recognition that this is how we like things to be, but that's just not how things are.
No, they're not. And I think next time, for our listeners, next time you're offended, and we know what offense feels like, right? It kind of rises up. We feel this sense of rising within us, we're indignant and sometimes we feel like we might need to fight back or prove ourselves.
Yeah,
right?
I'll show them.
Yeah. And so next time you're offended, you can actually ask yourself, okay, what story am I telling myself right now about this situation? And is there any other story that could possibly be true?
Oh my gosh. This is to me, I find this such a refreshing conversation because one, in Christian circles, we never have these kind of talks. It's always feels a little more prescriptive. But to actually stop and think about how we think.
Yeah, metacognition.
Yeah, I didn't know that word, but the concept of thinking about how we think gives us the ability to know that we have the ability, just like we do to take up an offense, we have an equal ability to leave it alone.
Yeah, we do. And I think that's a really key point, especially if we're so used to being so easily offended and quick to judge. That does require a bit of a pause and a rewiring, and for us to actually consider, how do I believe the best about this other person in this moment, right?
Yeah, which isn't easy.
It isn't easy, no. And I think our perceptions of others' intentions is kind of key here.
Yeah.
So I remember when you and I met, one of the first meetings we had, and you quoted Brene Brown.
Yeah.
And I was like, I can work with this guy. Like, I was like, that's awesome. So she is an author. She's a researcher.
Yeah.
Initially she studied shame.
My favorite podcaster.
Yeah, she's great. She's really great. And she says that her
Only know
life...
better than you.
Oh, thanks, Chuck.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. I'm really offended right now. She said that her life changed when she started believing that others were doing the best they could with what they have.
Yeah.
And it's funny because she tells this story of talking to her husband about this. And she's like, I'm trying to do this, but like, is it really true? She's like, are others really doing the best they can with what they have? And her husband said something fascinating. He said, you know what? Maybe or maybe not. But my life is definitely better when I believe that they are.
Oh, come on. That's so good.
Yeah. Well, and I think that we live in this place where, we're constantly interacting with other people, and somebody may do or say something completely unknowingly. Like you said earlier, they don't realize that they're offending us. And yet we're carrying around resentment for days, weeks, even a lifetime, right? Have you ever talked to people and they're literally carrying something from like 30 years ago?
Absolutely.
You're like, wow, that's a heavy weight to continue to hold. Now, we might be carrying this for a long time, but what was the impact of their comment on them? Well, it probably ended the moment after they said it, right?
Yeah,
They're moving along with their day. But I think that when we're easily offended, we think that people are saying stuff at us instead of to us.
Okay, this at us, not to us. If somehow that gets into that narrative, where as that thought continues, there's the ability to stop and think, that I don't think they threw that at me.
The phrase we use in just basic culture of this is like, we're taking it personally.
Yeah, okay,
right?
I like that. Yeah,
that's kind of what it is. We're taking everything personally.
So to do that, you have to want to receive that to some degree, don't you? I mean, like you've got to want to take that on.
Yeah. I think so. And I think for many of us, when we live in this place, we're looking at intentions, right? We're trying to look at the other person's intentions. And what I hear whenever I talk to clients about this is they're like, okay, Julie, that's fine that you're trying to believe the best and, consider maybe their intentions aren't bad. But what about the people who really are jerks?
Guy's a total a-hole.
Yeah. Like he actually told me that he meant to hurt me in that moment. Right. And you're like, I should be offended at that. Right.
Yeah.
Well, even so, when we look at Jesus's teaching, like you mentioned earlier, there still isn't room to be offended even when someone intentionally hurts you because we are called to forgive. We say, oh, I'm righteously angry, right?
Ooh.
Like it's right for me to be angry because they did something wrong. But the author of this fascinating book on the topic, it's called Unoffendable, he says it this way. He says, the thing that you think makes your anger righteous is the very thing that you're called to forgive.
Okay, just wow, right?
Well, and how do we, how would you conceptualize that, I guess, Chuck, for you being a pastor? Because it's hard. It's really hard to actually forgive when somebody is genuinely being hurtful.
Yeah. 100%, right?
Yeah.
So one of the things that I have to wrap my head around on this is that righteous anger, I think from a biblical perspective, is an oxymoronic term.
Yeah. And I'm glad you think that because not everybody does.
No. Matter of fact, I have plenty of peers who would, and this is dead serious preacher talk. I have plenty of peers, Julie, that would hear me say that and think, oh, you're just weak. You're soft on sin. You know, that kind of foolishness. And I would say, it is 100% easier to claim righteous anger than it is to hold on to biblical forgiveness.
Yeah, that's so true.
I would even go so far to say, Julie, that to take on righteous anger and claim it. What you're really doing is you're claiming righteous anger, but you're living selfish anger.
Yeah.
That the very nature of taking and holding an offense, you have made it about you.
Yes. Exactly.
And so now you're living in self, and in that self, you're actually taking on and living at a degree of personal sin because you haven't tried the walk of Christ.
Yeah.
And I can't believe I'm the one that's throwing this out, but psychologists, I read in preparation. I know it's shocking to you that I'm prepared.
I love it.
That people associate almost exclusively with those who agree with them, right?
Yes. Yes.
So from that group think, we get confirmation bias.
Right.
Right? Okay, now stick with me here.
Mm-hmm.
When we do that, we lose our ability to see events clearly or correctly.
Mm-hmm.
With that wall,
Yeah.
we now become easily offendable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How could they possibly think that?
Right.
And at the same time, they're looking at us saying, how could you possibly think that?
Yeah.
So last night I watched the most recent episode, end of season 3 of the show The Chosen, right? And so Jesus has got all these different groups that are at each other's throats.
Yeah.
And he's just having a conversation with them. And so his boys, they're ready to go to war.
His boys?
Yeah.
Is that what you call the disciples, his boys?
Yeah, I kind of like that myself.
I love it.
It's like, come on, boys.
Come on, boys.
And so he says, hey, boys, just sit down.
Yeah.
And he makes this statement that I think is very cool. He says, no, let them talk.
Yeah. Yeah. He's not threatened by their perspective.
No.
Right. He doesn't take it personally. And this is Jesus, right? Yeah.
I mean, so I look at this and I think, okay, hurting people hurt people. And people sometimes say hurting things to get attention.
Yeah.
And, in a shock jock world that we live in, a lot of this happens. I mean, but I read a blog recently, and I can't even remember who wrote it, Julie, but I thought it was really good. And it's an age-old thing. It's just fresh to me, I guess, to ask ourselves just 5 questions before we take on an offense or if we just try to retaliate verbally with an offense, Is it true? Is it helpful?
Helpful, yeah.
Is it inspiring? Is it necessary?
Yeah.
Is it kind?
Yeah. Think.
Yeah. And so I think the questions we have to ask, especially in the Christian world, is do we have the right to be personally offended?
Yeah.
Now just think about that question, right? As a Christian, do you have the right? Because that's really in America what our whole offense today is built around.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like,
yes.
do I have the right to be personally offended? So I think you look in Christendom, like all things, okay, look to Christ, right? So Jesus and all things done against him, in every offense made against him, more than we could ever suffer in 1,000 lifetimes, right? I mean,
he was right in everything too, right?
Including not being offended.
Yeah.
Personally.
Right.
Okay, so if you think about that, being offended then, going back to what I said earlier, is being too concerned with self.
Well, even neurologically, when we look at a cluster, like the neurological footprint of offense, there's a cluster of emotions that are connected to that. And self-consciousness, shame, all of those things, image, those are highly correlated with being offended easily.
Yeah. I mean, to take the way of Christ. And I mean, even if you're not a Christian listening to the podcast, I think we'd all agree if the world acted more like Jesus, we'd be in better shape.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So if you just took the model of Jesus of dying to oneself would say, don't take up the selfish position of offense. Forgive. And here's the thought. We are accountable to our Creator only for what we do and say. Sorry, my phone called. I'm bad.
It's okay.
What in the world? Sorry.
It's going to be important.
Probably. Okay, let's pick that up. So here's a thought. We're accountable to God only for what we do and say, right?
Right.
We aren't accountable for what others do and say about us or others.
That's a huge piece of this.
Right? So we aren't accountable in that. So it's best to do, as Paul says in Philippians 3, forgetting those things which are behind and press on to something bigger, life in Christ.
Yeah.
And so in some ways, I think as believers, lay down this foolish notion of righteous anger and holding this offense that here in America that I'm kept down and my rights aren't, all that's foolishness.
Yeah. I'd find the whole righteous anger fixation funny.
Yeah.
Because like psychologically, anger is morally neutral. I don't think people realize this.
That is a really, That's a big concept.
Yeah. Well, and we separate it because acting out of your anger and hurting someone, that's morally wrong.
Right.
But we like to attach morality to emotions. We like to think anger is morally bad.
Yeah.
Happiness is morally good. But emotions are morally neutral. It's the actions and behaviors that come from them that have a morality attached to them.
Yeah.
But in Christian circles, we throw this word righteous on top of anger. As if anger is like a fruit of the spirit or something. We're like love, joy,
it's
peace,
like cussing
righteous
somebody out
anger.
And saying in love.
Yeah. It's like, it's not.
No.
Like, it's not a fruit of the spirit. And as we've talked about, we do this surrounding real or perceived injustice, like you mentioned.
Yeah.
I think that there's a clear paradigm shift here. If you notice injustice, act, right?
Yes.
Like, don't dig your heels in and just be angry. You can act, you can pray, you can help, you can serve. But staying still and just digging our heels in with this righteous anger, it doesn't move the needle on injustice.
At
right?
all.
Like, it's like worry. Have you ever heard that quote? It's like, worry's like a rocking chair.
Oh, yeah,
you think you're going somewhere, but you're not, right?
Yeah.
We fret over things mentally and we feel like we've actually done something by like ruminating and thinking about it, but we haven't. It's the same with anger. Righteous anger, when we rage, when we stand indignantly, we feel justified, right? And we feel like we've done something productive. But in reality, I think a lot of times the only thing that's actually changed in that moment is our blood pressure. It's gone way up and it's not helpful.
That's so true. That is absolutely true. I mean, the scripture says in Matthew 10, Julie, that if rejected or if you are since you're wronged, right, shake it off and keep on working, even if you have to move to another church or city.
Yeah. Okay. So you're going to think this is funny. I love that they said shake it off because I do so much work with like our body and how our body carries emotions.
Yeah.
And there is something really, really powerful about the actual act of like shaking. Yeah. Literally it like discharges that angry energy.
Should we stop and play Taylor Swift real quick?
Yeah. Shake it off. I do that with my kids. I'm
do
like,
you really?
Yeah. If they are just carrying a lot, I turn it on. I'm like, just go crazy. Just let it out.
You know why I asked that question?
Why?
Horrible admission. Okay. So when I'm having one of those days.
Do you play it?
I do.
So I love it.
I get in my car and I crank it up so loud and I literally sing it to the top of my lungs.
That is awesome.
Could I just tell you how much better I feel?
Well, you are literally taking an emotion that is stored in your body and you are neurologically discharging it. Yeah, you are. And so you think about dogs, like, how dogs, like after they get, a bath or something, they're kind of stressed out and they shake, That's good for you.
That's me and Taylor.
It's really, really good for your emotions. And I'm just picturing this, like I
got to tell you,
you shake your hands.
I cannot believe I admitted that out loud, but I promise you, if you were one of those people that have this stuff all bottled up in you, just go ahead and hit Spotify, Taylor Swift, shake it off, crank it up. Like, go ahead and open the sunroof and sorry about that.
No, I love it. Also, you need to calm down is a kind of a good one too.
Oh yeah, I can see that.
As long as you're not saying it to someone else. Say it to yourself.
I think that's a good one. I think really do.
I can't believe you're a Swiftie, Chuck. This is amazing.
Okay, I really do. I love Taylor Swift. I totally do.
This makes me so happy.
And you know what else I love about Taylor Swift? What a business mind.
Oh yeah.
I mean, this woman is really bright.
She says all the time, she's like, I never want to be the smartest person in the room.
Isn't that great?
Yeah.
So
this has become a podcast about Taylor Swift.
Here's what I have learned, which sounds counterintuitive to shake it off. But the more mature you are, right, the less you allow others to offend you.
Yeah.
Because to do so is to allow pride to control us instead of the Spirit of God. And you can choose to not be offended.
Yeah. You can choose it. I think that's the key point.
Yeah.
We have to decide ahead of time before we go into a situation that we won't be offended. I remember when I first started studying this and there was a family member who was coming to visit and they were kind of the family member that I would easily always get offended by. And I remember deciding ahead of time, I am not going to carry offense in this trip.
Yeah.
And when you have that conscious decision, you are able to more consciously release some of this stuff, be quick to forgive, and then set any boundaries that you need to be able to move forward.
I had a meeting last week with a church member that I knew we were at odds about. Nothing significant, but just totally at odds. And they'd been pretty vocal about their disagreement with me. And so just in pure honesty, I mean, I needed to shake it off a little bit, you know, but I did. I made that choice coming into the meeting. I am not going to be offended because I want to know, why do they see it that way?
Yes. And so you laid down your need to be right.
Right. Yeah.
And when we do that, if we don't need to be right, then we don't need to reshape reality to fit the story of why we're right and they're wrong, and how we have the right to be angry about it. Right?
Okay. Here's a question for the therapist in the room. So I feel like it is an impossibility. Literally, I feel like it's an impossibility to spend your energy to prove you're right while simultaneously making things right.
I love that. I love that. If you're stuck constantly trying to prove that you're right, why don't you consider laying that down and considering, maybe I don't need to worry about being right. Maybe I just need to think about how to make things right.
Yeah.
That's one of my favorite philosophies.
Yeah. Isn't that rich, though?
It is so rich.
Yeah.
It is so rich because it actually creates progress and movement, and it creates empathy.
But it has something to do with one of the things I've learned from you over the course of all these podcasts is that this anger is just another emotion, right?
Yeah, we don't have to fear it, right? But we also don't have to come into this place where we can't ever feel angry, because that's not healthy either. We're not forfeiting our right to be angry in this.
Right.
Our body releases chemicals when we feel angry that move us toward action. So there's a reason why we're angry. Anger has a purpose. So we're not forfeiting our right to experience anger. We are forfeiting our right to remain angry.
Oh, that is so good. Because you can't avoid being angry sometimes.
Yeah.
But you can choose to not remain angry.
Not remain angry. Yeah. And I think when we choose to remain angry, we live in this place of entitlement, right? That we're just being denied these things that we should have, right? It's like, says who? Like, who says that you should never be hurt by another person? Like, that is just not what life is, right? So what do we do with anger, Chuck? We treat anger just like any other emotion. It's not a master, it's a messenger.
Right.
It tells us that, hey, maybe we need to set a boundary. We move through it and we let it inform us without causing collateral damage in the
Receive the message, disperse it.
Forgive.
Yeah.
And we're going to go into this more, I think,
in
next
part 2.
week.
Yeah. The key, though, is allow that messenger to be heard, right?
Yeah.
And then build a healthy boundary. Forgive it. And you are the one that benefits most from that simple gesture. Yeah.
And I think, this a lot of this has to do with where we find our identity and where we find our peace. And when we are easily offendable, it's because usually we expect someone else's actions to provide the source of our peace. And if they're saying or doing something that doesn't, then we get upset, we get offended, we blame them. And we are tethered to them in this way. So I say to people when they constantly say, well, this person is making me feel this, that, or the other, I say, well, you're giving them a lot more power in your life than is necessary. But here's the important distinction. I think we're going to break this down more in next week's episode. You cannot be unoffendable without having rock solid boundaries.
I believe that.
Otherwise, you're going to stay in destructive, hurtful, even abusive situations.
And that cycle just keeps on rolling.
In the name of forgiveness, right? So next week, we're going to break this down. How do we react step by step when someone hurts us? And our typical tendency is to become and remain offended. What do we do in that moment? And Chuck, I think it's going to be a time of fascinating application of this topic.
I agree. I think today was a great way to start the conversation about being unoffendable.
But it's even possible to live that way.
I love the idea of creating a baseline and being able to have some practical steps to know, how do I become that person?
Yeah.
And so make sure that you join us next week. I promise you that many of our listeners, Julie, heard this podcast today and thought, boy, there's somebody I need to share this with. And so I just can't encourage you enough to share these with friends, family. And one of the things that I have learned to do is call somebody and say, Julie and I just recorded this. I was thinking of you. while we were talking in a really good way.
Yeah, in a really good way. I like that.
And I'd love for you to give me some input.
Yeah.
And it is fascinating to me that this topic is so timely.
Yeah.
And our prayer going into today was that many of you would receive encouragement and hope, that this really was a positive conversation for you to take away. So make sure you do join us next week on the Positive Talk podcast, where we take a look at some pretty fascinating applications of the same topic, but through a different lens. So thanks so much for joining us on this week's Positive Talk podcast, where we always are merging faith and psychology, believing we can all live a far more peace-filled and purposeful life. We'll be back next week for another episode. And remember, you can always find all of seasons 1 through 3 and this season, season 4, on the Positive Talk podcast on our website, which is positivetalkpodcast.com. You can find us on Instagram and on Facebook at Positive Talk Podcast. And don't miss our YouTube channel, Positive Talk Podcast, where you can find the version of all of these unedited sessions where Julie never messes up and I constantly do.
That's actually the opposite, but thank you for that vote of confidence, Chuck.
Well, you know what? I didn't want to offend you.
I'm learning to be unoffendable, so we're good.
Well, then we're good. All right. Thanks for listening, everybody. Have a great week. Bye now.
Thank you for joining the conversation on this week's Positive Talk podcast. You can always find seasons 1 through 3 on our website at positivetalkpodcast.com. If Julie and Chuck shared something that inspired or encouraged you, please share this episode with friends, family, and your social media platforms. You can also find us on Instagram and Facebook at Positive Talk Podcast. As always, thanks for joining us, and go in peace.